Steve Harvey had hosted Family Feud for over 13 years, and throughout that tenure, he had encountered families from every conceivable background and circumstance. He had celebrated with families who won substantial prizes, commiserated with families who fell short of victory, and witnessed countless emotional moments that ranged from tears of joy to expressions of disappointment. However, his experience had also taught him to recognize when something deeper lay beneath the surface of a contestant's demeanor. He had developed an instinct for sensing unspoken struggles, for noticing the subtle signs that indicated a family was carrying burdens far heavier than the pressure of game show competition. What transpired on that cold February afternoon in 2025 would test Steve's emotional resilience in ways he had never anticipated, and would result in a moment of television that transcended entertainment to become a profound statement about compassion, dignity, and the hidden struggles of America's working poor. Before examining this extraordinary moment in detail, if you appreciate content that addresses real struggles faced by hardworking families and demonstrates the power of compassion in action, please take a moment to engage with this material by liking and subscribing to our channel. We share narratives that illuminate important social issues and remind us of our shared humanity and responsibility to support one another through difficult circumstances. The Thompson family from Detroit, Michigan stood on stage preparing to compete against the Garcia family from San Antonio, Texas. The Thompson family consisted of 68-year-old Dorothy Thompson, her daughter Sharon, who was 42, her son Michael, who was 39, and two of her adult grandchildren. Dorothy had raised her family through decades of economic hardship in a city that had experienced profound industrial decline and economic transformation. She had worked various positions throughout her life, most recently as a part-time home health aide caring for elderly clients who required assistance with daily activities. Her daughter Sharon worked as a cashier at a large retail chain, while her son Michael drove for a ride-sharing service to supplement his income from sporadic construction work. From the moment the Thompson family appeared on stage, production staff noticed that Dorothy seemed physically exhausted in a way that went beyond normal nervousness or the fatigue of travel. Her clothing, while clean and carefully maintained, showed signs of extended wear. Her shoes were scuffed and worn through in places. She carried herself with dignity, but also with a weariness that suggested someone operating on the absolute edge of their capacity. During the brief pre-game conversation where Steve typically asked families lighthearted questions about their lives and experiences, Dorothy mentioned that she was grateful to be on the show because it had been a difficult year for the family. Steve, sensing there might be more to that statement, gently inquired about what had made the year particularly challenging. Dorothy hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with drawing attention to her circumstances, but also perhaps sensing an opportunity to share a truth she had been carrying privately. She explained that she had lost her apartment 8 months earlier when her landlord had sold the building to developers who planned to renovate and convert the units into luxury condominiums. The existing tenants had been given 90 days to vacate, a timeline that seemed generous until one actually attempted to find affordable housing in a city where rental prices had increased dramatically, while wages for working-class jobs had remained largely stagnant. Dorothy had searched desperately for a new apartment she could afford on her limited income from part-time work and her small social security check, but every place within her budget had waiting lists of months or even years. She had temporarily stayed with her daughter Sharon, but Sharon's one-bedroom apartment was barely adequate for Sharon and her own teenage child, and adding another person had created tension and practical difficulties that made the arrangement unsustainable. Dorothy had refused to burden her children further, insisting that she would find a solution. What she did not initially tell Steve or the audience was the nature of that solution. It was only when Steve asked directly where she was currently living that Dorothy's composure finally broke, and the full truth emerged. She told him, her voice cracking with shame and exhaustion, that for the past 6 months she had been sleeping in her car, a 23-year-old sedan that she parked in different locations each night to avoid attracting attention from police or property owners who might force her to move. The studio fell into absolute silence as the weight of Dorothy's revelation settled over everyone present. Here was a 68-year-old grandmother who had worked her entire life, who had raised children and was helping to raise grandchildren, who by all measures had done everything society asked of her, and yet she was homeless and sleeping in a vehicle that was itself one mechanical failure away from leaving her completely without shelter. Steve Harvey stood frozen at his podium, his microphone lowered, staring at Dorothy with an expression of such profound pain and disbelief that it was clear her words had struck him with tremendous emotional force. For several long seconds, Steve could not speak. His eyes filled with tears that he made no attempt to hide or wipe away. His mouth opened as though he wanted to respond, but no words emerged because there were no words adequate to address what he had just heard. The audience remained silent, many people openly crying as they absorbed the reality of what Dorothy had shared. Her family members stood beside her with their arms around her shoulders, their own faces reflecting a mixture of sorrow, shame, and resignation that suggested they had been carrying this knowledge as a private family burden they had been unable to resolve. When Steve finally found his voice, it was thick with emotion and barely above a whisper. He asked Dorothy to forgive him for what he was about to do, explaining that he could not continue with the game as though he had not just learned that a grandmother was sleeping in her car. He told her that what she had shared was not just her personal story, but rather a window into a crisis affecting millions of Americans who worked full-time jobs and still could not afford basic housing. He said that her willingness to speak this truth on national television, despite the obvious shame and vulnerability it required, was an act of tremendous courage that deserved to be honored rather than glossed over in service of entertainment. Steve turned to address the production crew and made an announcement that departed entirely from standard protocol. He told them they were stopping production immediately and that they would not continue filming until he had made some phone calls and arranged some things. The crew, accustomed to Steve's authority and clearly moved by Dorothy's situation themselves, nodded their agreement. Steve asked Dorothy and her family to step backstage with him while he worked through what needed to happen next. The audience remained in the studio, many people discussing among themselves what they had just witnessed and expressing their own emotional responses to Dorothy's revelation. What happened during the filming break would later be recounted by production staff and family members who witnessed it. Steve had pulled out his phone and begun making calls to people in his personal network, explaining Dorothy's situation and asking for immediate assistance. He contacted a real estate developer he knew who managed residential properties in the Detroit area, explaining that he needed an apartment for a grandmother who was currently homeless. He contacted a furniture company with whom he had business relationships, arranging for a fully furnished apartment to be ready within days. He contacted a local car dealership and arranged for Dorothy to receive a reliable vehicle to replace her aging sedan. He made call after call, leveraging his relationships and his resources to assemble a comprehensive support package that would address not just Dorothy's immediate housing crisis, but also the underlying economic fragility that had created her homelessness. Between phone calls, Steve spoke with Dorothy and her family about their broader circumstances. He learned that Dorothy's homelessness was only the most visible manifestation of a cascade of economic challenges the family faced. Sharon was working full-time, but earning barely above minimum wage with no benefits or job security. Michael's construction work was seasonal and unreliable, leaving him with extended periods of unemployment during winter months. The family had no savings to cushion against emergencies or unexpected expenses. They were caught in the cycle that trapped so many working-class families, where any disruption to income or any unexpected cost could trigger a crisis from which recovery was nearly impossible without external assistance. Steve also learned that Dorothy had been reluctant to seek help from social services or charitable organizations because she felt ashamed of needing assistance and believed that resources should be reserved for people she perceived as more deserving, people with children or disabilities or other circumstances that seemed to her to justify need more clearly than her own situation. This attitude, Steve recognized, was both heartbreakingly common among people experiencing poverty and deeply problematic, because it prevented people from accessing support that existed specifically to help them. He spoke to Dorothy about the importance of recognizing that needing help was not a moral failure, that the systems that had failed to provide affordable housing and living wages were the problem rather than the people who struggled as a result of those systemic failures. When filming resumed approximately 90 minutes later, Steve returned to the stage with Dorothy and her family. His eyes were red from crying, and his usual energetic demeanor had been replaced by something quieter and more solemn. He addressed the studio audience and the cameras, speaking directly about what he had learned during the break and what he had arranged in response. He explained that Dorothy would be moving into a two-bedroom apartment in Detroit that would be provided rent-free for 2 years, giving her time to stabilize her circumstances and save money without the constant pressure of housing insecurity. He announced that the apartment would be fully furnished with everything she needed to establish a comfortable home. He revealed that he had arranged for Dorothy to receive a reliable vehicle to replace her aging car, ensuring she could continue working and attending to her responsibilities without the constant anxiety of mechanical failure. He explained that he had also connected Dorothy with a social worker who specialized in helping seniors navigate available benefits and support programs, because his conversations with her had revealed that she was not accessing various forms of assistance for which she was eligible, either because she did not know they existed or because she felt uncomfortable seeking them. Steve also announced that he was personally contributing $25,000 to Dorothy's family to help them address other financial pressures and build some emergency savings that could prevent future crises. He made clear that this money was not conditional on anything, not dependent on the outcome of the game show competition, and not a loan that would need to be repaid. It was a gift from him to a family that had struggled long enough and deserved support from people who had the resources to provide it. The audience responded with a standing ovation that lasted several minutes, many people still crying as they applauded both Steve's generosity and Dorothy's courage in sharing her truth. Dorothy herself was overwhelmed, sobbing openly as she tried to process what was happening. She kept repeating that she did not deserve such kindness, that she was embarrassed to have created such a disruption, and that she worried Steve was doing too much for someone he barely knew. Steve's response to these protestations was firm and clear. He told Dorothy that she absolutely deserved kindness and support, that she had worked her entire life and had earned the right to safe housing and basic dignity, and that the only embarrassing thing about her situation was that a society as wealthy as America had allowed a hardworking grandmother to become homeless in the first place. The game eventually continued with the Thompson family competing against the Garcia family, though the competitive element felt almost beside the point given what had already transpired. The Thompson family performed admirably, clearly energized by the support they had received and determined to honor Steve's generosity by playing their best. They won their preliminary rounds and advanced to the final round, ultimately accumulating enough points to win the top prize. The financial winnings from the game, combined with Steve's personal contribution and the value of the housing and vehicle he had arranged, represented a truly life-changing amount of support for the Thompson family. However, what mattered most to Dorothy, as she would later explain in interviews, was not the monetary value of what she had received, but rather the restoration of dignity and hope that came from having someone acknowledge her struggle and respond with genuine compassion rather than judgment or indifference. She said that sleeping in her car had made her feel invisible, as though she had become one of the homeless people that other citizens looked through rather than at, someone whose suffering was acknowledged only as an uncomfortable reality to be avoided or ignored. Steve's response had made her feel seen and valued again, had reminded her that her life and her well-being mattered to someone beyond her immediate family. When the episode aired 3 months later, the network preceded it with an introduction from Steve himself, filmed specifically for the broadcast. He spoke about the housing crisis affecting working families across America, about the reality that millions of people were one emergency or one rent increase away from homelessness, and about the importance of addressing these systemic issues with policy changes rather than relying solely on individual acts of charity. He acknowledged that what he had done for Dorothy was wonderful for her and her family, but was not a sustainable solution to the broader crisis. He called on viewers to support organizations working on affordable housing, to advocate for policies that protected tenants and ensured living wages, and to vote for representatives who prioritized housing security as a fundamental right rather than a market commodity. The response to the episode was immediate and overwhelming. Within 24 hours of broadcast, the clip of Steve breaking down after hearing Dorothy's story had been viewed more than 50 million times across various social media platforms. Thousands of people shared their own stories of housing insecurity, of living in vehicles, of choosing between rent and food, of working full-time and still being unable to afford basic shelter. The episode sparked a national conversation about the working homeless, about the failure of wages to keep pace with housing costs, and about the inadequacy of social safety nets designed for a different economic era. Advocacy organizations reported significant increases in donations and volunteer participation following the episode. Several prominent figures in entertainment, business, and politics announced initiatives to address housing insecurity in their communities, explicitly citing Dorothy's story and Steve's response as inspiration. Some municipalities began examining their policies around affordable housing and tenant protections, pressured by constituents who had been moved by what they witnessed on a game show and wanted to ensure their communities were doing more to prevent similar situations. Dorothy Thompson became an unintentional advocate for housing security and the rights of the working poor. She was invited to speak at various events, sharing her story and explaining the daily realities of being homeless while employed, the constant anxiety of trying to maintain hygiene and professional appearance without access to reliable facilities, the physical toll of sleeping in a vehicle, and the psychological impact of existing in a state of perpetual insecurity and shame. Her willingness to speak openly about experiences that many people endured silently helped create space for broader acknowledgement of housing insecurity as a widespread crisis rather than an individual failure. Steve Harvey continued to reference Dorothy's story in interviews and public appearances. He spoke about how the encounter had changed his understanding of homelessness and poverty, forcing him to recognize that the stereotypes he had unconsciously held about homeless people did not match the reality of working grandmothers sleeping in cars. He talked about the importance of listening to people's stories rather than making assumptions based on appearances or circumstances, and about the responsibility that came with having a platform and resources to help others. The incident also prompted changes within the Family Feud production process. The team implemented more comprehensive support systems for contestants who revealed significant struggles or hardships during filming. They established relationships with social service organizations in various regions so they could quickly connect contestants with local resources when needs were identified. They created a fund specifically designated to assist families who appeared on the show and were experiencing crises, recognizing that Dorothy's situation was likely not unique and that the show had both the opportunity and the obligation to help when possible. 2 years after her appearance on Family Feud, Dorothy Thompson was living in the apartment Steve had arranged, which she had been able to maintain through a combination of her work income, properly accessed benefits, and careful budgeting supported by financial counseling services. Her daughter Sharon had received job training through a program Dorothy had been connected to via the social worker Steve had arranged, and had transitioned to a better paying position with benefits. Michael had found more stable employment through connections made at a workforce development program. The family had begun to build the financial stability that had eluded them for so long, breaking a cycle of crisis and insecurity that had defined their lives for years. Dorothy remained in contact with Steve, sending him updates about the family's progress and photographs of the apartment she had made into a warm and welcoming home. She told him that she prayed for him every night, grateful not only for the material support he had provided, but for the dignity with which he had treated her when she was at her most vulnerable. She said that she had learned through her experience that asking for help was not weakness but wisdom, and that accepting help was not shameful but an acknowledgement of the fundamental human truth that we all need support at various times in our lives. The story of Steve Harvey breaking down when a grandmother revealed she had been sleeping in her car became more than a memorable television moment. It became a cultural reference point in discussions about housing insecurity, a reminder that homelessness affected people who defied easy stereotypes and simple solutions. It demonstrated the power of compassion combined with resources, showing that individual acts of generosity could transform lives even while highlighting the need for systemic changes that would prevent such situations from arising in the first place. The episode was used in educational settings to teach about poverty, housing policy, and the working homeless. Social work programs incorporated it into their curricula as an example of trauma-informed response to disclosures of hardship. Business schools examined it in discussions about corporate social responsibility and the role of public figures in addressing social issues. The clip of Steve's emotional reaction became emblematic of authentic empathy, a demonstration that genuine compassion sometimes required setting aside professional composure and responding to human suffering with honest emotion rather than practiced detachment. If this examination of housing insecurity and the power of compassionate response has provided meaningful perspective, please support our channel by liking this content and subscribing for future narratives that address important social issues and human experiences. Share this story with others who might benefit from understanding the realities of working poverty and housing insecurity, and consider how you might support organizations and policies that work to ensure everyone has access to safe, stable, affordable housing. In a society that often judges people by their economic status and living situations, let us remember that circumstances do not determine worth. That hardship can affect anyone regardless of their work ethic or character, and that our collective response to those who struggle defines our values more clearly than any abstract statement of principles. Steve Harvey's willingness to stop his show, to cry openly, and to mobilize his resources on behalf of a grandmother he had just met remains a powerful testament to the difference that genuine compassion can make when combined with the power to act.